Thank you. Good morning and welcome to almost our last Atlas webinar for the year. My name is Tara Duncan. I am the chair of Atlas. Atlas is the Association for Tourism and Leisure Education and Research. We're an organisation founded in 1991, almost 30 years old, with the purpose of bringing together all of those interested in tourism, teachers, researchers, industry professionals, and giving them a forum to network, coordinate, and learn more about tourism. Today's webinar is part of our Atlas Africa chapter, which was founded in 2000, and we held the 11th conference in 2019, and are looking forward to holding another conference next year, hopefully on site somewhere, but we will obviously see how the year goes. So today we have 4 speakers who will be talking to us. And so without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Emmanuel, and he will moderate the session alongside Renee and Willem, and hopefully everyone will have a great session. Actually, just before I do that, 2 things to mention. As I said, Atlas has 2 more webinars this year. One, hopefully next Friday, as part of our Erasmus Plus project, NTG, Next Generation Tourism. And then on Monday, the 21st, we're hoping to hold a more informal webinar, a Swedish fika, we might say, a social coffee break, to allow Atlas members and those interested in our organization to come along and have an opportunity to meet each other. So without further ado, Emmanuel, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Tara. Good morning, everyone. It's great to have you joining us through our live stream on YouTube. Yeah, just before I forget, please use the chat on YouTube when you have questions, and then we'll pick up the questions and give them to the panelists. So please bear that in mind, that if you have any questions or comments or remarks, use the chat function on YouTube. And it will also be great if you're joining us on the YouTube channel to briefly introduce yourself and also tell us where you are joining us from, so others can also know. And in such a way, we have an opportunity to also network and connect with colleagues from different parts of the continent and outside of the continent. So this morning webinar is basically going to be around trying to discuss how COVID has impacted the tourism sector in Africa. It's been almost a year in, and we try to take stock of actually what has been some of the resilience and some of the stories of managing to survive for the tourism sector and stakeholders with the impacts of COVID. And while taking stock, we also hopefully will be able to see into the future in terms of what lies ahead for the tourism sector in Africa over the next year and over the next period. How do we manage to get things going? I won't take the wind out of the sail of our panelists, but I would like to say thanks to our panelists for accepting our invitation. We have 4 of them from the north, south, east, and west. And I'll do a quick introduction, but I also want to say thanks to my co-organizers, Renee and William, who helped, and Leontine, who helped to put together this webinar. So thank you very much. They are following the chats and will be reading your questions. So thank you for that. So the structure for the webinar is going to be quite straightforward. We have around 90 minutes for this, and we break it into 2 parts. So the first part, our panelists will introduce themselves briefly and then give their take on the first discussion point as to what has actually been the impact of COVID on the tourism sector within their region, within Northern Africa, within Southern Africa, Eastern and Western Africa. So they will have about 5 minutes to respond to that question. And after they've all done a round, then we'll have a Q&A session. And that's where we need your questions from the YouTube chat. So post your questions in there after that round. Then we'll have a discussion on that. And then we'll move to the second part of the webinar, which is discussion point 2, which is about how will the post-COVID future look like for the tourism sector. And our speakers, again, will do a round of around 5 minutes based on their experience and based on what they know in their region. And then afterwards, we'll have a general Q&A from the audience where you join in. And then we'll have a wrap up at the end. So that's how we hope the structure will be for the event. So Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speakers. We have from Northern Africa, we have Ennis. We have Ennis, sorry for that. We have Ennis from North Africa, she introduced herself. And then we have Judy from Eastern Africa. And then we have Ishmael from Western Africa, and then also Andrea from Southern Africa. And for the first round, I'd like us to take it north, south, east, and west in terms of order. So we start from the northern part because it's easier, north, south, east, and west. So we start from the north, and then we go to the south, and then we come to the east, and then we end up with the west. And then in the second round, we do the other way around, going from west, east, south to the north. So Ennis, if you please introduce yourself and then give us your take on the first question. Thank you.
Hello everyone, so I am Ines Mistewi, a PhD student from Tunisia in Nice. Welcome and thank you for allowing me the opportunity to talk about Tunisia and the impact of COVID-19. Thanks a lot.
You can continue with the first question. The others will introduce themselves and then continue with the first question of what has been the impact of COVID within Northern Africa.
Okay, so I start my intervention.
Yes.
I will impact of COVID-19 on the Tunisian tourism, and then try to wrap it up by presenting predictions and speculation for this industry. First of all, I feel it's contextual characteristics of Tunisia. Probably most of you know Tunisia as the country who triggered. So I will start presenting some previous national crisis situation and hiccups to see the consequences and their impacts on Tunisian tourism. So as you all know, after the revolution, the situation was quite political and social instability, and then the succession of terrorist attacks. Maybe the most impactful one is the one of Bardo and Sousse, where the majority of made Tunisia be considered as and decreased the number of tourists by 33.6% compared to the year before, to the previous year. These attacks so this and the succession of terrorist attacks, unfortunately, the tourism sector in Tunisia, making the government exclusively focused on European and mass demand. It started to be profitable despite the economic and social. 1.4 million tourists, despite all this difficulty. Tourism, despite this record, COVID-19 problems that already existed. So down, the government is as hospitals in Tunisia. It has several impacts on so many levels. We'll try to go through them together briefly. So first impact is an economic one. So obviously, as same other countries in the world, Tunisia is unfortunately suffering severe impacts of the COVID-19, as presented by Habib Ammar, who is the current Minister of Tourism. Most of the bookings have been postponed. There was a drop in border arrivals of around 75% in the first 9 months of 2020. Tourism revenues fell by about 60%, and overall overnight stays by about 80%. So Some professionals may describe the situation as catastrophic, and indeed, if we compare the current situation with, for example, we may this is as the worst crisis in the history of independent Tunisia. This is an economic one. Is a socio-economic was the revolution and the terrorist attacks, as I said already, have weakened tourism, but this year has been very tough. Those who have money have been able to survive, but those who have not, unfortunately, perished. This applies to large and small structures, because if I may explain the situation to you, after 2011, after the revolution, small businesses, tourism have emerged to resist to mass tourism. They have been blooming for years now. They have significant demand, but unfortunately, they are the one most impacted by the COVID-19 crisis, because they are running these small entrepreneurs are running small businesses, and so their projects were really impacted. The government chose to assist, to have contributions to large structures, but did not help the smaller ones, because they are with no significant profits compared to large structures. Plus, they are independent, so they are not backed by any institutional power defending their interests. So we may say that the COVID-19 unveiled and maybe enhanced problems of marginalization and inequity. The third impact is a political one. As same protocol elsewhere, we've chosen the lockdown, but last June we have a steady situation of zero cases during several days. So the government was in a challenging situation and a moral dilemma, and the borders opening last June was under the pressure of the tourism sector. We've welcomed 131,000 entries during June and August, and to boost and stimulate tourist flows from Europe, the government scheduled Poland, the shares very recently. Most of the European have decided to extend their lockdown for economic reasons, and recommended to their people to enjoy leisure activity on a national level. So this, in my opinion, this was a mistake. We the start point, and experiencing now we're living now the second wave of the COVID-19 and its impact on so many levels.
Yeah, thank you very much, Enes. Now we'll go to Andrea.
Thank you, Emmanuel. I'm Andrea Simon. I'm from Northwest University in South Africa. I'm an economist, so I do like showing graphs and figures, and for that reason, I'm going to share my screen to show you a couple of pictures that I've made, because I wasn't too sure how many of you are familiar with Southern Africa and tourism in Southern Africa. And so I am sharing my screen so that you can see the presentation I've made. So I want to introduce firstly what tourism in Southern Africa is like. So just as an overview, my focus is on Southern African countries, but Southern Africa is very, very difficult to define because some people include more countries and some less countries. So my focus is on the 7 most southern countries of Africa, which would be Namibia, Botswana, Zimbabwe, Mozambique, Eswatini, South Africa, and Lesotho. So as an introduction, I'm first going to show you what was the trend before COVID-19. In other words, what was happening in Southern African tourism. And I have to do it on two graphs because South Africa is actually dominating the market here. So 55% to 60% of all tourists coming to Southern Africa actually goes to South Africa, while the rest, other Southern African countries share the spoils. So in terms of that, you can see South Africa had up to 10 million arrivals from 2017 upwards. And on the left-hand side, you can see the best performing markets here is Zimbabwe with about 2.5 million arrivals, and also Mozambique, which is quite a growing market. So this was sort of the general trend before COVID. It's a growing destination, and South Africa especially is showing nice growth, and it's spilling over to the rest of the region. What you may not know is where most tourists to Southern Africa come from. And similar to what we see worldwide and also in trade is if we talk about international trade, it's more prevalent to trade with your neighbors, and the same is here with tourists to Southern Africa. So even to Southern Africa, we are dominated by African tourists. About 77.6 to 80% of the market comes from Africa. Our second most important source market is Europe. And then thirdly, the Americas. The rest are really very low in tourist numbers to Southern Africa. Now, if we look at what it looks like in Southern Africa, we can see it's a very inter-regional affair. So the numbers, the arrow shows flows from this country to the next country. So here is flows from Zimbabwe to Mozambique, from South Africa to Mozambique, from South Africa to Eswatini, and so forth. And you can really see that we are really dependent on one another for our tourism market. So if you look, for example, at South Africa, 74% of all our tourists comes from Africa. For Namibia, it is 78%. For Botswana, 85%. So it's really a regional affair. And therefore, if we talk tourist numbers first, if the region suffers and if South Africa suffers, it really spills over to the rest of the region in terms of tourist arrivals. So just for comparison reasons, our most important international markets you can see are the US, the UK, Germany, France, and then Portugal, who travels also to Mozambique, being an ex-colony of Portugal. So you can see the percentages compared to what I've shown in the previous slide are much lower than we've seen previously. But even though these are lower share markets, they are quite important markets to the Southern African continent. So our regional markets are very much shopping markets. So in the previous slide, these are cross-border shoppers. They are visiting friends and relatives, and they are business tourists mainly, while our leisure tourists and really the high-value markets are our international markets. Those are the ones who come and stay and go for the safari and go for the expensive hotel. And this is one of the reasons why Southern Africa is still suffering due to COVID. Now, just quickly on what it looks like in terms of COVID in the region. For Namibia, you can see in 1st of December, there was only about 14,000 cases of COVID. Remember, though, that the countries are small in terms of population, but here you can see on the bottom graph, the blue line shows us when was the peak. So that was only of COVID cases, that was only month 8, month 9, so which is end of August. But the red line shows us the travel restrictions, and 4 means that it is closed borders. So even though cases were very low in the beginning in Africa, the borders were already closed. And that means we really missed the whole European season of opening up. So when Europe was opening up a bit, South Africa and Southern Africa remained closed to tourists. Only relaxations came from month 7, which was quite early for Namibia, and for most of the others, you can see only month 9, month 10 is when we saw relaxation of controls by governments to allow tourists come in. So a number 2 here indicates that some regions still have to quarantine when they come into to the region, and a 1 is only screening. So for South Africa, obviously being the largest country in the region, we have much more COVID cases. Also, our peak here, you can see, was end of July. And but we only opened up borders in October, and then only travel started to pick up. So to show you a bit what happened in the hotel sector, so I have to thank STR for this data that they provided. You can clearly see that hotel occupancies compared to 2019 was much lower. We're talking of 80% declines throughout the months of March, April, May, June, July. You can also see that, remember, Namibia opened up quicker, so they caught a bit of the international travel market there and saw an upsurge in hotel occupancies. And South Africa's only really started again after the opening up of the borders. So to show it more clearly, this slide is from STR, and they show how slowly Africa is really recovering compared to the rest. Now, the reason for that is quite easy. It's what I've shown in the previous slide, is that we were closed when Europe started opening up. And Europe started closing now, we are opening up. So it's a bit of a synchronization problem between seasons in the southern hemisphere and in the northern hemisphere. And therefore, recovery is really quite slow. If you look at it in South Africa, if you look at tourist numbers and arrivals, you can see, as we all expected, that regional tourism are the first ones to recover. And African tourists to South Africa is basically 12% of what it was in 2019. So it's a really slow recovery. And for the other regions, you can really see there's not much tourism activity going on. The impact that this had on the sector was profound. So you can think the closures, there was really not much going on. So we've basically seen a standstill of the tourism industry, closure of restaurants and small tourism businesses, although there was some support given by South African tourism. Government don't have enough funding to keep everyone going. What is also widespread is a bit of not so many layoffs in the industry, but taking less pay, working less hours to see if we can still keep the jobs going. So this is typically what we have been seeing. We've also started seeing hotel takeovers, so some of the bigger groups that's suffering, and we are seeing takeovers of some of those big hotel chains in the economy. On the positive side, while the lockdown has really seen a fall in GDP in South Africa, no production going on, we had a strong recovery as soon as the economy opened up, so better than expected. And even though we were in a recession before COVID and the lockdown started, it seems that GDP has rebounded, and therefore incomes in South Africa is starting to rebound as well, which is good news for the region, given that the region is quite dependent on South Africa for tourism numbers as well. So that is just for me a bit of background and what has been happening in Southern Africa. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Andrea. And now we'll move to the east with Judy.
Thank you for having me. Good afternoon from Nairobi, Kenya. I will share a little bit on what is happening in the East African region, the impacts of COVID. And I will start by giving an overview of tourism in the region. Generally, East Africa is a mass tourism destination, sometimes also described as high impact, low value tourism. And this is the same for Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania. Today we have Eastern Africa expanded to include Burundi, to include South Sudan, and we also have Rwanda on board as part of the East African destination. So much of the maturer destinations in East Africa, which is Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania, they are all defined by mass tourism. Another factor that defines tourism in this region is that most of the tourism is nature-based. To be more specific, it's mainly about wildlife, and in some of the countries, it's about the beach, and a little bit of a combination of mountain and forest-based tourism. So much of it is nature-based tourism. There are elements of cultural tourism, but it is never the main attraction for people coming to this region. It is an add-on to the main products that are promoted, which is wildlife and beach tourism. Also characteristic of tourism in the East African region is that tourism is seasonal. It's seasonal, and the seasons are mainly defined by weather patterns in the source markets, not in the local areas, not in East Africa, because this is a destination that is accessible throughout the year. But we have seasons because that is the time when our source markets can travel. So we have two major seasons in a year, the high season and the low season. And this is one of the reasons for the vulnerability of tourism in this region. Another characteristic of tourism in this region is the over-reliance on the international source markets. We've only seen in the last 5 to 10 years, destinations trying to promote effort to promote domestic tourism. It is, and regional tourism, it is growing. We have seen policies around visas now that allows people to travel within the region with one visa or no visa for the East African residents. In the past, it was a requirement for some countries, but also for international tourists to be able to travel across the region with one visa. So over-reliance on the international markets, which is the main source of tourists for the region, is a definitive characteristic of tourism. Another characteristic of this tourism in this region is the weak supply chains. And when I talk about weak supply chains, is that the region is dependent on other platforms and other regions for the marketing and promotion of their destinations. Today, many of them are reliant on online travel agencies, and these have taken over much of the marketing and sales of tourism in this region. And for that, we have a massive problem with the leakage of revenue outside the region, which is also a big challenge. Last but not least, and this is not unique to East Africa, I might say so, but that tourism in this region is very vulnerable to certain specific things. It is vulnerable to health challenges, and COVID is just one of them. We have had Ebola, sometimes yellow fever, sometimes even when the health challenge is not from this region or from Africa, we remain extremely vulnerable to health challenges. The region is vulnerable to political unrest. Anytime there is political unrest, the destination will suffer for a while, and it takes them a whole 2 or 3 seasons before they can recover. The region is also vulnerable to security uncertainties, and particularly we will be talking about the terrorism and terrorist attacks that happened in the region has continuously affects tourism in this region. We also recently beginning to see elements of climate vulnerabilities, with flooding in some destination, excessive rains that are affecting what was considered good seasons, and continuous rains causing movement of people, closing of facilities, issues of accessibility are beginning to emerge. And last but not least, we have a big problem, which is also got to do with the economic vulnerabilities. Economic vulnerabilities are actually as a result of minimal retention of revenue in destinations, but also the fact that the industry is defined by a large scale of micro, small and medium enterprises that basically live from hand to mouth. They come and go within a very short time. Sometimes some of their lifespan is just about 6 years. If they never manage to grow from micro enterprises into medium enterprises and they stay micro up to 6 or so years, you find that they change, they go into doing other things, or they fall out and new ones are continuously emerging. So these are the things that define tourism in this region. So what did it mean then for COVID? What does it mean for tourism? First and foremost, because we are a nature-based destination, it means that most of our natural areas where tourism happens is protected or is dependent a lot on tourism revenue through entry fees. Now, when we don't have those entry fees, then there are challenges in raising enough revenue to effectively man and manage these places. So there have been reports. I think it's too early to say exactly what the impact has been, but there has been reports of risks of increased poaching in some of these destinations in the protected areas that depend on tourism because of lack of revenue. Also, the revenue that used to trickle down to the small businesses that are dependent on tourism in these places is not available. And that now has opened even for domestic hunting in some of the places where it had been contained because people were benefiting from tourism in different ways. So we have seen there is the risk of loss of protected areas or of poaching and all the risks to the environment because there is no income that is coming in from tourism, and tourism is nature-based, and so it is dependent on tourism revenues for management of these places. Of course, like the rest of the world, there has been a loss of jobs. There has been a close of businesses. I just recently read that one of the popular hotels in Arusha has been turned into a hostel. And this, I'm not just talking about popular because it's visited a lot. It's very high profile because heads of states, many heads of states have stayed in this hotel, which tells you that it is not a small enterprise, it's not a medium enterprise. This is a hotel that has been established for a long time to get the confidence of heads of state to stay in this particular place. Now, if this business changes because it cannot survive and now has to get revenue by converting into a college hostel, then we can tell the impact that has been on smaller businesses and smaller hotels and smaller lodges in the tourism industry. So there has been closures, there has been change of ownership, the sales of business. A lot of things have happened in that particular area. The loss of jobs is massive. Loss of job is massive, and even those who remain in employment are most of the time on half salary or even less than a half salary. And that is happening in all the destinations in Kenya, in Uganda, in Tanzania. That is a standard, that salaries have been cut while many, many more people have been sent home. We have had economic stimulus packages, but it is too little to reach everyone. And especially it's too little to reach the informal sector, which is the micro, small and medium enterprises in the tourism industry. And even in the mainstream industry, only a few of that segment is going to access this sector. Another thing that has happened, and which is about the quality of employment and the type of jobs in the tourism industry. The tourism colleges have their students asking whether really it makes sense to study tourism. We know that it is time to evolve, that there's the impact of technology, but for a long time, I think tourism has taught what is the traditional careers in the industry. Some of these traditional careers are affected. I have just come off a webinar with Uganda Tourism Board where we were discussing the place of sustainable tourism development in building resilience as tourism restarts post-COVID-19. And one of the things was about strengthening internal business environments. It is also about rethinking careers in tourism because this has been affected. And now we have to think about what kind of employees do we want. Today, the ones who are still in employment are being forced to take on 3 or 4 roles, 2 or 3 roles within one facility. I'm bringing to question whether the effort that is put in training today in certain careers in tourism is worth it if anybody can take on those careers or those jobs within a very short time. What are the kind of jobs that tourism should be putting their efforts in? I will stop here for now.
I think, we can get to that when we get to the second segment about the post-COVID outlook and what needs to change. So thank you very much, Judy. And now we will have Ishmael to give us an overview of what's been happening in Western Africa or West Africa.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much, Ima, and thanks to Atlas for this platform. I must say that when it comes to tourism, West Africa receives the smallest share. I mean, compared to North Africa, South Africa, and then East Africa. However, in terms of growth, the West African sub-region seems to be experiencing the highest growth rate until COVID-19 set in. When I talk about West Africa, I'm talking basically about the area from the island of Cape Verde all the way along the coast to Nigeria and then to Mauritania in the north. So you are talking about countries like Ghana, Senegal, Togo, Liberia, Sierra Leone, Nigeria, Mali, etc. Now, traditionally, West Africa has offered heritage, products. West Africa has these slave castles along the coast. The majority of slaves who were sent to the Americas were kept in these slave castles before they were shipped to the Americas. And today, the African diaspora want to come back and then walk in the footsteps of their great-grandfathers and their ancestors. And so diaspora tourism is a big thing. Additionally, we also have some very nice beaches, along the coast. And so you have a lot of Europeans, especially coming over to West Africa, to places like the Gambia, to enjoy the scenery and also to appreciate nature. But lately, we are also experiencing a growth in business tourism. And if you look at the sub-region, Nigeria especially has positioned itself. Some very good quality, hotels and convention centers have been put up. Ghana, about more than 50% of our tourism market is now business. And so you realize that in terms of the product offerings, there is now a diversification from the traditional heritage tourism to other products. Now, for us to better appreciate the impact of COVID-19 on the West African sub-region, we have to look at the situation before COVID-19 set in. And I must say that in the year 2012 to 2016, the West African sub-region experienced a slump in tourist arrivals and tourism receipts, essentially because of the Ebola virus pandemic. So you realize that as a result of Ebola, tourist arrivals dropped by about 25%. And the area is not new to crisis. Apart from the Ebola crisis, we have also experienced a general, insecurity, especially Boko Haram in Nigeria, Mali, and other places. And so this really affected tourism. But in the year 2018, tourism bounced back. And so it set itself on a growth trajectory. If you look at Ghana, for instance, in the year 2019, tourist arrivals went up from about 984,000 to 1.1 million. In Senegal, it also shot up from 1.3 million to 1.7 million. And then in the Gambia, which is relatively a smaller, country, tourist arrivals shot up from 200,000 to about 230,000. And so you realize that tourism was on a growth trajectory. And then the year 2019 saw a lot of activities on the continent geared towards attracting the Africa diaspora. We had the Roots Festival in the Gambia. Nigeria had its carnival, in some of the states. And then in Ghana, the government launched the Year of Return. Now, the Year of Return was a resounding success in the sense that it accounted for, a meteoric, rise in tourist arrivals, and coupled with increase in, economic activities. And tourism was able to generate about $1.9 million as a result of the Year of Return. The government was expecting to build on the Year of Return by launching Beyond the Return, a 10-year program to engage the diaspora, further. But then COVID-19 set in. Generally, around March, COVID-19 cases had been reported in West Africa, and governments took very decisive, actions. The first thing was to close the borders and then embark on contact tracing. The contact tracing, to some extent, helped some of the upscale hotels because the visitors were lodged in those hotels for, I think, 2 weeks. But then generally, because the borders were closed, it meant that most of the flights were grounded. And so the impact was very significant. And you would appreciate the impact better if you appreciate the fact that in West Africa, we depend essentially on inbound tourism. Our domestic tourism markets are not well developed. And so we rely essentially on inbound tourism. And you also look at the fact that the COVID-19, the impact was greater during the peak tourist season. You are talking about June all the way to August, September. And this was the period that our borders were closed. In Ghana, for instance, our borders were opened in September. In Nigeria, it was reopened in August. And so we lost a lot of arrivals. COVID-19 had a devastating toll on tourism in West Africa. And it has been estimated that it will cut tourist arrivals by about 60% compared to the 2019 arrivals. Now, in some West African countries also depend essentially on tourism. You are talking about Cape Verde. Cape Verde, tourism contributes about 43% to their GDP. And so if the tourists are not coming, and they also rely essentially on the European market. So if the tourists are not coming, it sort of shuts the whole economy. And in Gambia, about 20%, tourism accounts for 20% of their GDP. And so these countries have really bear the brunt of the COVID-19. As I said earlier on, there had been declines in tourist arrivals. Not only that, all flights were grounded. At a point, some domestic flights were allowed, but because our tourism industry does not depend on the domestic market, it didn't really help the tourism industry. The airlines suffered a lot of losses. They were in deep financial distress. The government revenue from civil aviation also dropped. In Ghana, the Ghana Civil Aviation Authority announced that they were losing about 95% of their revenue as a result of the grounding of flights. And if you look at 2018, for instance, the Ghana Civil Aviation Authority was able to generate 475 million Ghana cedis. So if 95% of that was lost, that is quite substantial. Occupancy rates also dropped from 70% to less than 20%. In some cases, for a greater part of the period, hotels were shut down and workers were sent back home. Some had to be laid off and some had to receive a drastic cut in their salaries. And so there were a number of changes. The Ghana Tourism Federation, for instance, announced that they were going to lose 800,000 jobs. In Nigeria, the tour operators and travel agencies announced that they were going to lose about 35,000 jobs. And this is just a small segment of the market. And so the various tourism businesses were in dire financial distress. And if you appreciate the fact that most of these businesses were small to medium scale enterprises, then you would appreciate the fact that the effect was really harsh on them. And no wonder, in most cases, government had to come in and institute stimulus packages for these businesses to keep them afloat in the midst of the pandemic. And so I think that essentially the impact was negative, yes. And you were asking whether there was any positive. For me, the only positive perhaps would be the environment, because as a result of people not traveling and flights being grounded, it gave our environment the opportunity to troubleshoot, and so the benefits will really accrue to the environment. And I think for me, that was perhaps the only opportunity, coupled with the fact that it also gave us, the tourism industry in general, it gave us the opportunity to reflect on our situation and see the way forward, for the future. And so I will end here with the first question. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ishmael, for a response. So yeah, now we've come to the session for Q&A, and we already have some questions from the YouTube chat. So if I could ask all our speakers to turn back their camera, then we can get to the questions. And also for our viewers, yeah, please keep the questions coming. We'll start with what has already been posted now. So there is a question from Julius, Julius Warren to Andrea. So it's a question about your country analysis that it's Watini appears to have been experiencing a decline in tourist numbers even before COVID hit, and he's wondering what account for this decline.
Thank you, Mario. Which country have experienced a decline? South Africa or?
It's Watini.
Where is Watini?
It's Watini, yeah.
Let me just get to the numbers here. Yeah, Eswatini actually has been a bit of a stable series. It experienced a huge jump in 2004. I'm not exactly sure what caused that huge jump, but since then it's been up and down and very stable around the thresholds. So I know there's a lot of tourism from South Africa to Eswatini, and then also from Mozambique. So and with instabilities in Mozambique at this stage, I'm not sure if that is driving it a bit down. So in Eswatini, if I go to the more robust numbers, I can quickly check which ones are experiencing a bit of a decline. And it seems to me, if I look at the numbers, that there was a huge growth in East Asian market, but that started to taper down a bit. So it might be from that region that is driving the decline mostly.
Okay, thank you. And then there is another question from Barma Hillary, which is both for Northern Africa and Southern Africa. So the question is about the issue of marginalization and exclusion of smaller players in Tunisia, for example, for Ennis, and within Northern Africa. So what accounts for this issue of marginalization and exclusion? Is it the weaker lobbying power that they have, or the lack of critical mass that they have?
Yeah, as I said earlier, it's a problem of an institutional power, of independency, because they are not backed by any power, by any institutional power trying to defend their interests. So that made the government choose to help the large structures and not try to contribute in any way to the smaller businesses. And the marginalization is for small businesses, for small entrepreneurs, impact in a way direct and indirect jobs, because small guest houses and small projects and private projects, for example, they are working with women, they are involving women, for example, trying to having odd jobs and low incomes, and they found themselves, unfortunately, because of this crisis, without any resources overnight. So yeah, it's a problem of marginalization and exclusion on so many levels, and particularly concerning the small projects and the small entrepreneurs and the small businesses.
Okay, and that the question also relates to Southern Africa, that there seemed to be a similar pattern developing in Southern Africa.
Yes, well, what we've seen in Southern Africa, especially if we look at Mozambique, for example, there was huge developments from international companies there, with a lot of lack in SME development in those areas. And this was sort of a trend. We've seen it through the world, especially with nice beach destinations, as we have in Mozambique. In South Africa, for example, there's a bit more balance between the local SMEs and huge hotel groups. And in that regard, I think the stronger domestic tourism market in South Africa plays a huge role in supporting the smaller players in the market. It's also true that government has allocated funds, especially to the smaller to the smaller players in the market, to keep them going, while the bigger ones are a bit in a tight spot at this stage, but they have supported them. But and in a way, especially in the African context, like the East African context as well, where they say there's very little domestic tourism. The domestic tourists in South Africa is really supporting the smaller ones. And as we've seen now, as soon as we could travel between provinces, self-catering accommodation and lodges, etc., they are the ones that's picking up in the South African context.
Okay, thank you. And then we can continue with the issue of domestic tourism in the Eastern Africa. So Julius also has another question to Judy about why, even though there is a push within Eastern Africa to promote domestic tourism, Tanzania is not comfortable with a single visa. So your thoughts on why Tanzania is not comfortable with a single visa, which is aimed to promote domestic tourism. And then the second follow-up is whether you feel the market in Eastern Africa is moving towards sameness. So same product, same tourist market that they are trying to attract, and whether you feel this is an opportunity to differentiate between markets in the region.
Thank you very much. It is true, Tanzania has not been receptive to the idea of a single visa in the region. And I want to believe that these reasons are more political than any other reason. And probably it's got to do with personalities, and it's got to do with histories, and it's got to do with something to do with egos. As we speak today, between Kenya and Tanzania, forget about the single visa. We still have issues about Kenyan tourist vehicles entering Tanzania. Tanzanian tourism vehicles can come to Kenya and can pick and drop passengers at Jomo Kenyatta International Airport and drive through Arusha and go into Tanzania. Kenyan operators cannot do that. They have to exchange. If they have visitors going to Arusha, they've got to go to the airport and hand over the clients to Tanzanian operator with Tanzanian vehicles, but their vehicles are allowed here. We have a very interesting scenario where it is very possible to cross between the Mara and the Serengeti for a visitor who is in the Mara and wants to go into Serengeti. It's just a river crossing, which is possible even on foot, but you have to get back all the way to Nairobi, take a flight, or go drive all the way to Arusha, or drive to Tanzania to go into Serengeti, whereas you could cross at Sand River and go. You can stand on a border post and say that there is Tanzania, it's Serengeti, but you cannot go because of those restrictions. And I think that it is about their foreign policies. And like I said, this is more political than anybody in the tourism industry would begin to understand why it is so difficult for them to get into this space, whether it is for fear that there won't be fair trade, that they will lose out if they go into this, that it is more easy and more accessible, that maybe Kenya has more airspace and visitors will just be flying in here and going into Tanzania, and that will mean loss of revenue to the government in terms of landing fees. And so I think there is a whole mix of issues here that the authorities in Tanzania maybe have not been so willing. Maybe they're not very ready at this point. They feel they're not ready to join the single visa policy. Now, moving whether East Africa is moving towards sameness. There are certain elements where East Africa is trying to work together, like on the issue of visa, of the open borders and open boundaries. Also on the issue of hotel certification, we now have a standard that is applicable across East Africa, so that a 4-star in Kenya is a 4-star in Tanzania. It should be the same in Rwanda and in Kenya. And this is about standardizing quality of service in the region, again, to make visitors comfortable, that if I get this single visa and I book a 4-star in Tanzania, I know that if I get to Uganda or if I get to Rwanda or Kenya, the quality of the product is going to be the same, because in the past, this was very, very varied. And this affected the cross-border tourism, where visitors come to one country and can experience the other. Now, there is a challenge when we talk about sameness in terms of the experiences being offered. In terms of quality, I think the standardizing quality of service is very important. But sameness of experience for me is a challenge. And it's the same challenge that I have when we talk about the Africa Tourism brand. I keep asking myself, what is this brand that is called the Africa Tourism brand? Are we saying that we are all going to want to offer the same things? We can't have an African tourism brand. We can have an African tourism model, and we can have African tourism standards and other things, but not call it the African tourism brand, because this sameness can be a challenge for some countries. The countries that are already developed for wildlife tourism, for example, and if we all want to offer wildlife tourism in the region, they will always have an advantage over the other. So uniqueness is important. uniqueness also encourages a destination's competitiveness. If there's something totally unique about going to Rwanda and walking to or tracking the gorillas, going to Uganda and the chimps, and coming to Kenya and doing a different wildlife safari and doing a safari in Tanzania, I think that is what builds the competitiveness of the destination. So as a person, I don't think that we should move towards sameness of experiences and products of service that we offer in the region, in terms of employees' careers, in terms of tourism training. We can standardize this training and say that if this is what you call a safari guide in Uganda, and I get a safari guide in Kenya, they will have the same competencies, because the curriculum for training of the guide has been standardized. The same way with hotel classification. In those areas, we can be the same. In terms of products and experiences, I think uniqueness builds competitiveness of a destination.
Okay, thank you very much, Judy. And then let me look at the questions. And this is for Ishmael. So in terms of the West Africa region, so what has been, you talked about government stimulus packages, but who has benefited from these? And are there examples of countries or which sectors of the tourism industry gets these stimulus packages?
Yes, basically the stimulus packages were targeted at tourism businesses to cushion them off the effects of the COVID-19. Ghana, for instance, the government instituted a $1 billion dollar package. It was general in terms, in the sense that it was targeted at all businesses and not just tourism-specific businesses. And so these businesses were required to apply for the package. And then in addition to that, there was also a syndicated loan. A syndicated loan was almost interest-free, very minimal interest rate, which the tourism businesses could also apply for. So we are talking about all businesses, along the spectrum, talking about hotels, restaurants, tour operators, etc. We know that the implementation of the package has been fraught with some challenges, and some industry players have indicated that the processes are cumbersome, and some have even indicated that they have not received, any package. But I think that to the extent that the government, would have thought about them and instituted such packages, and even held some engagement with their associations, the Ghana Tourism Federation and other industry players, I think that it is a very good initiative which will go a long way, to help these businesses, to keep their heads above waters. And so I think that it is not only in Ghana, in the Gambia too, there has been a stimulus package. Governments of most of these West African countries had to go to the Bretton Woods institutions. And in Ghana, I think we went to the IMF for, I think, $1 billion, dollar package for businesses in general. But of course, tourism businesses are also benefiting from that. And so I think that that was a good initiative. I mean, considering the fact that in West Africa, most of these businesses are small to medium scale, and they were having serious financial challenges. And so these packages have gone a long way, to help them, survive.
Okay, thank you very much. And there are other questions, but I think they are more appropriate for our second segment, so I'll leave it at that. But a quick one to Judy from George Aria about whether Rwanda, in their effort to promote sustainable tourism, is kind of changing the mass market. So you talked about that East Africa tourism is mass market. Is what Rwanda is doing a way to change that sort of label of East Africa being a mass market? So just a 1 minute response to that.
Yes, I think Rwanda has been very deliberate. We all, those from East Africa and in tourism area, remember that Rwanda decided to hike its gorilla fees, and operators and everybody complained and said it will not, they will not be able to sell, they will not, but the viewership and the visits have not gone down. It's because Rwanda said, we want to manage this. We want to make it a high-end, low-impact form of tourism for us. So there are those drastic policies that Rwanda has put in place for its tourism. For example, when it comes to giving back to communities for tourism that is taking place in rural areas, the policies are very clear. In a number of countries, it is spoken. In East Africa, it is said that we are doing sustainable tourism because we have a certification scheme. But when you go to real tourism policies to find out whether this has been documented, you don't find it. In Rwanda, the engagement and support of communities, if you invest in a community area, is documented because they're looking for a different form of tourism that also brings value to the host communities. And by doing this, they are also limiting the type of investments that they can have in their country, the type of tourism investments that can happen even in those rural areas. So yes, if we are deliberate and intentional in our policies like Rwanda, we can begin to transform East Africa from a mass tourism destination.
Okay, thank you very much for your response. Like I said, there are questions, but they will come after the second round of comments. So hopefully we can keep this to 5 minutes. We go around back and then we'll have a larger part of the time to continue with the discussion. So we'll go from west to east to south and then to north. So the second segment, the question is really about, based on what we've taken stock of, what does the future look like and how do we make sure that the future is sustainable and differentiated and benefits communities. So we start with Ishmael.
Yes, thank you very much. I think that we all admit that we find ourselves in the new normal. And so the old way of doing things ought to be, changed. I believe that in the short term, tourism businesses in West Africa are going to experience a number of challenges. I must, however, admit that these challenges are not unsurmountable. For instance, there are still going to be layoffs and cuts in employment because the tourists are not coming. And these businesses are finding it difficult to survive, pay for wages and also pay for social security and other taxes. And so in the short term, they are going to be confronted with these challenges. The decline in arrivals will not immediately recover from the decline in arrivals. It will take some time. And history tells us that whenever there is a major pandemic like this, it takes on the average about 2 years, to recover fully. And so, yes, tourist arrivals have declined. Our borders, especially the airports, have been reopened, and some flights are trickling in. But I think that for us to recover fully, we need to institute certain measures. And I believe that a lot will depend on government policy. In Ghana, for instance, we all know that when it comes to the domestic market, it has been ignored for a very long time. Unlike in some parts of East Africa and Southern Africa, where there was a deliberate, government policy to encourage, domestic tourism. We haven't had that. And so looking at the current situation, I believe that government will have to encourage domestic tourism. I think we are gradually having an expanding middle class in West Africa, especially in Nigeria, Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, Senegal. And so tour operators have to capitalize on this local market and develop products that will appeal to this segment of the market. One of the major obstacles is the cost of accommodation. Accommodation in Ghana is quite expensive. And so it's really a disincentive for people who want to, travel within their own country and go and stay in a hotel over the weekend, And so we need to look at some of the charges, some of the tariffs that the hotels are required to pay. I also think that we ought to focus on the regional market. Yes, and I like what is being done in East Africa, the single, visa arrangement. I think that West Africa, we need to collaborate more. Tour operators in Ghana should collaborate with their partners in Nigeria so that we can develop multi-destination itineraries. Every country has its strength, and the diversity, I think, will appeal to the tourists. And so we need to collaborate more and develop our regional markets. Another reality that has hit us with the COVID-19 is that people are now living in the virtual world, just like we are experiencing this morning. We are having, this virtual, panel discussion. I think that we need to develop our digital systems, internet connectivity, and then the price, the cost of connectivity is quite high. I mean, for the average person in a typical West African country, it is expensive. And so here too, I think there should be some policy. And I think during the heat of the pandemic, the telcos entered into an arrangement with government, and some tariffs were slashed, and it made it more affordable. Tourism businesses should now begin to develop virtual tourism. It is a market that has not been given that consideration, even though in other places, they are now developing smart cities and smart tourism. We don't find that in West Africa. So I think that we need to develop our digital systems, and businesses should also invest in technology. The hotels, the restaurants, and even the destinations should all invest in technology, because that is the new normal. And so you either conform or you are not competitive. And so I think that these are some of the things that we need to institute going forward, because this has become the new normal. And for us to recover quickly from the pandemic, these are some of the specific initiatives that we have to undertake. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ishmael. And now we'll go to Judy for a brief overview.
I'll not be able to put on my video unless the host does that. Thank you.
Okay.
But this region post-COVID-19. Now, for tourism to build forward post-COVID-19, we cannot recover. We're not building backwards, we're building forward. So tourism needs to build forward post-COVID-19. And there are certain lessons or realities that COVID-19 has exposed about tourism in this region. I didn't mention the defining characteristics of tourism in Eastern Africa. But as we go forward, there are certain things that we will need to take care of so that we can build a more resilient sector. And one of the things that is very important going forward is to strengthen the internal business environment for most of the micro, small and medium enterprises. Their weaknesses are found in their internal business environment. And this internal business environment includes a number of things, includes their access to market intelligence information so that they can plan around this market intelligence information and build their products and build their strategies and services around market intelligence information, other than just coping and trying to do what another company. I saw another company take people to Mount Elgon. I'll also start a company and take people to Mount Elgon without knowing what is it that makes that other company tick. What is it, what is the profile of their client? So we have a lot of businesses in tourism in this region that have no access to market intelligence information. They don't even know how to go about it. And there are a number of things within the internal business environment that needs to be strengthened, because we cannot have a strong tourism industry if we do not have strong tourism institutions and businesses that are running this industry. Because if they're strong enough, they will be agile enough to be able to withstand some of the uncertainties that come their way, but they will also be able to read the times, to know who their client is, when to change, how to diversify. So we must begin by providing support to this large segment of tourism that is made up of micro, small and medium enterprises, very significant for the tourism industry in East Africa and Africa at large, that they are strong enough, they are strengthened enough with internal business support so that they can provide services and they can remain resilient even in the midst of crisis. It became very clear that a number of these small businesses do not have a crisis management plan. They do not have risk management plans. It is not one of the things that they do, because they just learned to do the business from either having just worked in a company as a safari guide, or they are straight off college and they know how that tourists, you can get people and put them in a vehicle and take them for a package and they will pay and you get your commission. But they are not strengthening their own businesses. So that is one of the areas building tourism forward in this region will need us to focus on strengthening the internal business environment. Having said that, another important thing going forward that we need to do in this region is to make tourism more accessible. And when I talk about making tourism more accessible, I'm talking about diversifying the consumption. Diversifying the consumption from over-reliance on international markets to also the domestic market. To diversify consumption means that we will also have to diversify the product to make tourism more accessible for different demographics to access the tourism product, but also at the same time to allow many different players to be able to operate in that particular space and be integrated into the bigger tourism supply chain. Making tourism accessible is key for building a resilient tourism industry going forward. I had mentioned this and I will repeat it. There is need to look at new business models that will result in retention of revenue within the destination. There's a lot of leakages because of the business models that have been adopted from other places today. And that means that going forward, we will also need inclusive forms of tourism. Inclusive forms of tourism includes ecotourism, includes responsible tourism, it's about including women and youth in tourism, including those who are in the rural destinations where tourism happens. Integration would have to be key. Last but not least, Emmanuel, we have to change our investment question. our tourism investment question will have to change. We'll start by asking what impact do we want tourism to have, instead of asking how much revenue do we want from tourism, and so how many people do we need to bring in. Sorry, thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you very much. And we'll go quickly to Andrea.
Thank you. Yes, thank you, Emmanuel. Well, if we talk about the short run and the long run, so in the short run, I've identified some positives and some negatives, and in the long run, some opportunities and some challenges that Southern African region and then Africa in general might face. So on the positive side, firstly, we have to acknowledge that 70% of all countries around the world have lifted travel restrictions. So it is becoming easier to travel. So that's a positive that will have an impact on the tourism industry in Southern Africa as well. For Southern Africa especially, a large portion of our tourists are regional tourists, and as we've seen in the graph, they are the first ones to recover, but this is also what everyone expects. So domestic tourism and regional tourism will recover before we see intercontinental tourism recovering. So our forecasts show that by end of 2021, 60% plus of the international tourists will recover, or regional tourists, so numbers will be approximately 60% of what they have been in 2019 before COVID. So it's a much quicker recovery if you are reliant on regional tourists. If we look at more data, we can see that the mobility index for Southern Africa was already at 100%, which means it's business as usual. People are moving around, and this means things can restore in the short run. And also the interest on Google searches is very high for South Africa, Namibia, and Botswana, which means that there are interest in visiting Southern African region worldwide. Some of the negatives, though, for us is our long-distance markets, which are the high-value markets, are the slowest and will be the slowest to recover. Our forecasts show that by end of 2021, it will be less than 50% of what it has been in 2019, which means that the high-value markets will not be coming. And places like Cape Town and Botswana and Mozambique, which are very reliant on those high-value markets, might find that those areas of business will be slowest to recover. So, well, another negative is, remember I showed the regional dependence on South Africa, and South Africa already experiencing recession before we went into COVID. So newest growth figures showed that we are exiting that recession. So hopefully if South Africa grows, the region can grow as well. And then another negative for the short run is African governments and Southern African governments aren't well funded. So we cannot afford to have packages to support all the businesses, and therefore business failures, we will see it in the short run. Just some opportunities and risks for the long run. Opportunities, I think Africa can really think about itself and repositioning itself. And if I look and listen to what Judy says and what some of our other speakers are saying, you know, thinking of regional structures, e-visas, crime prevention initiatives, those are the things that can say, well, we can move forward. And in a way, also, we offer less crowded destinations. And in this sense, remoteness might actually count in Africa's favor. If we can say we are a safe destination, we can prove that we can take care of health issues, then this might be something to position ourselves to say we are less crowded, less chances of pandemics. We have been through the Ebola pandemic and come out through that in West Africa quite well. So if we can do that, there's really opportunities for Africa to position itself in the market and to think where we should be. Now, I want to, so there's two types of things that can happen. So we're working with human behavior. So on the one hand, we can say people have had cabin fever. They've been locked out and they would like to go out and see the world and experience new experiences and things that only Africa can bring them. On the other hand, there's the famous prospect theory by Kahneman and Tversky, which says that, you know, if we look at probability distortions, that if there's a low probability that something will happen, people tend to overweight that probability. And this is where, saying to the world that Africa is ready, we can offer health services, we can offer safe destinations, that might be just the difference there. On the risk side, I think restoring confidence, we've mentioned it here, Africa is vulnerable to all kinds of shocks, and getting confidence back that Africa can continue and will continue to be a safe destination, that would be one of the key risks. Weak economies worldwide, low growth throughout the world. Remember, international tourism is a luxury product. If you don't have money, you're not traveling. So getting those international markets means we have to hope that economies will pick up worldwide. I want to add here the older European population. So a lot of our European visitors are some of the older markets, and given the pandemics, they are less likely to return to traveling quickly. So this is something in the long run to look to, and then restoring air connectivity. We've seen a couple of airlines folding. Getting airlines to fly to South Africa and Southern Africa would again be one of the challenges for the future. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Andrea. Last but not the least, what's the outlook in Northern Africa?
Thank you, Emmanuel. So as I explained earlier, because of the successive crises Tunisia lived, we had more than 10 ministries. Unfortunately, each one of them has had its own short-term vision, policies, and strategies, which made different from the previous one and the one following them. And maybe because they had to handle a crisis situation, trying to promote Tunisia and to save the touristic season. So the context was kind of urging us to rethink the whole strategy and trying to rebuild a new one. But we find ourselves, unfortunately, in a simple strategy of continuity. So as a scholar interested in tourism study, I have suggestions and advice maybe to tourism deciders. I think that first of all, Tunisia has to have several audiences. The Tunisian government should innovate. The seaside tourism, on which Tunisia has been betting for decades now, has brought the system to its limits, particularly during the security crisis we've experienced after the revolution. So competition is fierce, and the government should stop promoting Tunisia as a low budget, a mass destination, just having beautiful beaches and all-inclusive stay where tourists don't leave their hotel, or don't move from their hotel just for a 2-hour tours in the Medina of Tunis or in Sidi Bou Said. Tunisia has a lot to say, a lot to tell, a lot to offer, and the government should enhance its various forms of tourism, the cultural one, the Saharan one, the ecotourism, the medical tourism. Also, the previous crisis taught us that Tunisian tourism should not exclusively depend on the international market, because if there is one thing is sure, Tunisians living abroad and Maghrebian followers are the one who saved the touristic season for several times now, especially after the revolution and when we had, unfortunately, the terrorist attacks. We should also try to reorganize tourism. We should opt for a better use of the Tunisian territory. As past experiences illustrated, an anarchic recovery may not lead and cannot lead to significant results. We should coordinate, organize, and better manage the tourist flows. For example, the government may enhance the customer and offer diversification and a more balanced distribution throughout the territory. It may also create and enhance the paratourism offers with, for example, more differentiated offers throughout the territory. It should also enhance and encourage and promote small projects, private projects, because they are trying to revitalize tourism, the Tunisian tourism, and creating, maybe changing, creating a new dynamism in the landscape of the Tunisian tourism. And we may also have a recovery plan. Tunisia must capitalize on the past, if we may say, successful experiences and the management of the previous crisis. There is a real desire for the Tunisian tourism players to get out of this crisis, but most importantly, with long-term, persistent, and viable strategies. This crisis may be a moment of a deep reflection and an opportunity to think our problems, our tourism problems, differently, trying to pose radical solutions and trying to enhance tourism and subsequently the Tunisian economy. Thanks a lot.
So now if our panelists would on their camera, we have some questions that have already come in, and then we are catching up to time. But this is, yeah, there's a question for 30 seconds responsible. We'll start with Ishmael. So what should be tourism and hospitality education in terms of content and pedagogy? What should it look like to really develop a post-COVID tourism sector? What needs to change within our curriculum? Your microphone.
COVID-19 has taught us a lot of lessons, and it is becoming increasingly clear that you need some kind of skill set to be able to survive on the job market. And so I think that our students, we need to incorporate ICT education or ICT skills into our curriculum, because our students need to acquire those skills in order to be able to survive. It has become clear that tourism businesses should now focus on digital marketing, and that tourism businesses should invest in technology. And so I believe that graduates of tourism and hospitality should be able to acquire those skills in order to survive. Another important skill is crisis management skill. I think our sister from East Africa, Judy, pointed out that most of these businesses are small to medium, and they don't even have crisis management programs in place. We are all praying that this should not happen again. But I mean, the future is unknown. The ability of tourism businesses to come out of such situations unscathed is very, very important. And I think that our graduates should have the requisite crisis management skills to be able to deal with such situations. And lastly, I think that COVID-19 has also taught us that we need to improve on our sanitation skills. And so increasingly, even if you work at the back of the office, you need to be aware, and you should be able to undertake, basic cleaning, and also how to maintain a certain degree of hygiene within a facility. And so especially for our hospitality students who will be coming out, we need to equip them with this enhanced sanitation skills so that they will be able to survive on the job market. So these are the three main skills that I think we have to incorporate into our current curriculum.
Okay, and I'd like to move to Ernest as a student of tourism. So to think, what have you missed in your training and education at this point, and how that should change in the future curriculum? So what, given the current situation, what you think students have missed so far and so should change in the education?
What we've missed so far in education, in fact, I'm a marketing student, but just interested in tourism studies. But what students maybe are missing in the studies, I think if there is one lesson to be learned from all this crisis is that we keep having, unfortunately, we keep doing the same mistakes. The government still helping promoting the large structures and instead of helping the small structures, which may change, revitalize and change everything in the tourism in Tunisia. So in keeping, we keep having the same mistakes, and we keep increasing the same inequalities, and that's for me is the problem of tourism in Tunisia, and unveiled and enhanced by this crisis. But as we are having a crisis over many other ones, so the problem is much bigger.
Okay, thank you very much. And this is to Judy from Benedict Dogley. So is there any long-term strategies within East Africa specifically in terms of making sure that local communities and locally owned businesses help to minimize leakages? So going forward, are there any plans or strategies to minimize these leakages?
I think there's goodwill, and sometimes goodwill is just good intentions. There is goodwill, but we have not seen deliberate government action or policies to go out of their way to make sure that they cushion these small businesses from the leakages that they have to experience because of the way the supply chain has been is structured today, and that is how tourism happens. There is no deliberate effort to bring them together, to bring small businesses together. But I'm so happy to see small businesses in different countries coming together to pull together and provide support for each other. Yesterday, we were launching a report that we did for the small businesses in tourism in Kenya who came together and have formed their own association. And we did a survey together with them to look at the resilience within their businesses and what are their areas of weaknesses at the moment, whether they are compliant, basic compliance with the government requirements and policies. And it was surprising. They are very compliant. But when it comes to the supply chain, they're facing challenges. And so now they're thinking, can we work together and start contracting as a group and not as one small business? So we go out and contract on behalf of our members, and then our members can supply using these particular rates. Now that's a very private sector move led by SMEs because they have had other partners. We've been working with them. They've had other partners trying to strengthen them. So yes, there's goodwill probably from the destinations, but public sector policy to do this does not exist. And I hope, as it has been the case in much of development of tourism in this region, is that practice has always preceded policy. That practice, government has seen practice, and when they could not ignore it anymore, they made it into a policy. So let's hope that as we push for these small businesses and they come up with their own models on how to minimize the leakages, that at some point these practices can inform policy.
Okay, and that leads on nicely to our next question from Mandisa Silo to Andrea. So also about tourism resilience and policy. And Mandisa wants to know, could there be a compelling case for Southern Africa Development Community in strengthening regional tourism integration through a common policy agenda? Is there any plan?
Yes, for sure. For sure. I mean, we see it right through. I mean, there's always been a strong case to have a regional policy for tourism, and we find it anyway that there's lots of spillovers from the South African markets to neighboring countries. So that single visa idea, that regional tourism growth and the regional tourism policy is something that Africa should pursue. I've done some work on East African tourism as well, and that's the same there. You know, the region is growing, but they can grow so much better if they work together. And the same for Southern Africa. So for sure, policies should not only look at country specific, but also include your region, because together we can be so much stronger.
Okay. Let me look at my last questions. I think there's been some few last one that came. Okay, so there's a question from Dandy Bandimo about the impact of COVID on tourism labor, and if there's been any protection, government protection for tourism workers in terms of after lifting the lockdown emergency. Are there cases in which there are specific government protection measures for workers, tourism sectors, in your region?
Shall I go? Yes, in Kenya, we saw government protection coming in for a segment of tourism that protects the natural environment. So a 1-year salary package was provided to community conservation areas to pay salaries for rangers for 12 months. And it's because of the vulnerabilities that I spoke about, the risks that I spoke about earlier on, being a nature-based destination or region. It is very important that we keep our natural areas intact. We protect our wildlife during this time. And if there is no tourism, then some of the community areas were not receiving any revenue, and so could not have been able to sustain all their rangers on job. But with this government stimulus package that is paying salaries for the rangers in these conservancies for 1 year, it was really a good move to protect labor in wildlife and conservation area. I wish it would have been extended to lodge and hotel workers, but there are limits. Yes.
Okay, well, thank you for that. So there is a final question here from Kimo. Kimo is talking about the importance of tourism research and collaboration and how that might help with kind of tourism recovery across the continent, but with particular attention to Francophone African countries. So he rightly points out the lack of representation of, for example, Central Africa in the panel. So any thoughts and ideas how in your various work you collaborate across Francophone and also Portuguese speaking African countries?
Well, I must say that unfortunately, in West Africa, we have the Francophones and then the Anglophones. Unfortunately, when it comes to collaboration, especially between the Francophones and the Anglophones, it hasn't been that smooth. And I think basically it has to do with the language barrier. Yes, but there have been a few instances where, for instance, in my university, we do receive some faculty members from some Francophone countries. Some students from Francophone countries also come here to study English, and some of our students also go there to study French. But I believe that going forward, we have to streamline this collaboration because COVID-19 and some other crises, including even the issue of Boko Haram, etc., it cuts across borders. And we have to trace and establish the effect of these crises across the sub-region. So I believe that we have to extend, a hand of collaboration to each other and then conduct a joint research. In fact, some of the instruments could even be translated into French. And then when we analyze and then we do the report, we can equally, translate it into French. So I think that as academics, we need to come together. It will help us in addressing the issue, especially in view of the fact that COVID-19 doesn't affect just one country, but then the impact is felt, across, all over the world and across the sub-region. So I think that for me, I see it as a suggestion, and we have to take it on board and see how best we can operationalize it.
Okay, thank you. Okay, that's about the questions. There is one from George Aria, and that's basically to Judy, that your company should become, well, you should also appreciate that your company, STTA, has been championing sustainable tourism within the East Africa region. So that's more a comment about the work that you've been doing. I think it does tally up to the fact that it tends to be the practices that take the lead before the policy come on board. And it will be good going forward that we can have, well, if not an inversion of that, at least the policy and practice go hand in hand much more closely. The policymakers can see the need to start those initiatives. So thank you very much all for your time, your knowledge, and your discussion. Really appreciated. I'm sure that the people following the live stream are also very appreciative of your inputs. So thank you very much. We are slightly over time, but thank you very much for sticking around with us. And this brings us to the end of this event, looking at the impact of COVID on the tourism industry and the way forward and how it looks like. So hopefully, maybe when we get to halfway in 2021, we can look back to see what are some of our views and hopes about changes in the sector has come to pass and how things are picking up. So thank you very much once again, and enjoy.